Baalbek, Lebanon. June 1993. In a walled compound below the dead Roman temples, a man they called Haj Zulfikar had not set foot on open ground in 19 months. He moved weapons and money through the Bekaa valley for Hezbollah, and he had learned the lesson of the road, that a careful man dies the moment he becomes predictable. And yet, across the border, in a Syrian garrison town, his eldest son was about to be commissioned an officer, on a parade square, on a published schedule, before a full reviewing stand. It was the single morning the father could not stay hidden. A foreign service had waited all that time for exactly that. This is Operation Threshold. You are inside Agent Uncovered, where one buried operation is opened at a time. Subscribe and follow the file to the last page. Begin with the valley, because the valley explains the man. The Bekaa runs for 120 kilometers between two mountain walls, a high floor of vineyards and orchards about 1,000 meters above the sea. And in the summer of 1993, it belonged to Syria. 30 to 40,000 Syrian soldiers held the country. Their intelligence service ran the valley from a headquarters at Anjar in the Bekaa, under a general named Ghazi Kanayan, whose informers reached into every town. Whatever moved through the Bekaa moved with their knowledge, or it did not move at all. Above the town of Baalbek, at 1,170 meters, stood the ruins that gave the place its old name, Heliopolis, the city of the sun. 6 columns of the Temple of Jupiter still rose almost 20 meters into the dry air, the largest classical columns anywhere on Earth. A short walk away, the Temple of Bacchus, 66 meters long, still held 19 of its 42 Corinthian columns upright, better preserved than almost any Roman temple standing. Before the war, an international festival had filled those courts with music every summer since 1956. The war had closed it in the middle of the 1970s, and it would not reopen until 1997. So the greatest classical ruins in the world stood silent and unlit, night after night, above a militarized town. The town beneath them lived the way all of Lebanon lived that year, at the far end of 15 years of war. The currency had come apart. The power failed for hours at a stretch, and the streets ran on the cough of private diesel generators. Old Mercedes saloons served as shared taxis, packed and patched and running on smuggled fuel. On the radio, between the news, the country still played Fairuz. It was a place worn down to its patience, and patience was the one resource the coming operation would need most. Baalbek was the northern stronghold of Hezbollah. Since 1982, Iranian Revolutionary Guards had trained fighters here, based at the Sheikh Abdallah barracks on the town's edge, and the movement's writ ran through the streets beneath the Syrian one. Inside that stronghold, behind a wall on the valley floor, lived a man whose name almost no one outside the movement knew. His documents said Kamal Rida Saba. The movement called him Abu Ja'far, the father of Ja'far. On the intercepts and in one foreign file, he was Haj Zulfikar. He was about 49 years old, and he was the movement's quartermaster. He arranged the routes, the trucks, the payments, the storage, the crossings that kept a fighting organization supplied. And in an insurgency, the quartermaster is worth more than any gunman, because the gunman is replaceable and the network is not. Sabag understood exactly what he was worth, and he had built his life around the arithmetic of it. He did not attend rallies. He did not pray at the same mosque twice in a season. He kept no car that could be recognized, and he moved when he moved through couriers and a single tapped landline over which nothing of substance was ever said. A foreign service could name him. It could draw the wall of his compound from the air and guess the room he slept in. What it could never do was find a moment when he stood still, in the open, on a schedule that someone else could read in advance. For 19 months, there had not been one. The service watching him already knew, in exact and recent detail, how a man like this is killed. It had watched it happen the year before. On the 16th of February, 1992, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Abbas al-Musawi, drove home from a memorial in the south of Lebanon. His route was known, his timing was known. In the late afternoon, 2 Israeli attack helicopters put missiles into his 3-vehicle convoy on an open road and killed him, his wife, his 5-year-old son, and 4 bodyguards. Within days, the movement named Hassan Nasrallah in his place. The killing changed the war without ending it. The lesson traveled through every careful man in the Bekaa, and Sabag learned it better than most. A hardened target is reached on the one predictable line between 2 points he cannot avoid. The route home, the standing appointment, the habit he cannot surrender. The whole craft of protecting such a man is the removal of pattern. The whole craft of reaching him is the discovery of the single pattern he has left. There was also the plain problem of the ground. Sabag did not live on an open road in the south. He lived inside Baalbek, in the heart of a stronghold ringed by the movement's own men and shadowed by the Revolutionary Guards, under a Syrian security umbrella that watched every stranger. A missile into that town would start a war on its own. It would also, almost certainly, miss. A quartermaster does not stand at a window on a timetable, and a strike that leveled a house to reach one careful man would announce, in fire, exactly who had been hunting him and why. Whatever reached Sabag would have to be quiet, deniable, and precise to the meter. So the service set the idea of a strike aside. You cannot strike a man you never see. What it proposed instead was something slower and, in its own cold grammar, more patient, a study. It would treat Sabag as a routine to be solved, and it would search a life engineered to have no fixed points for the one fixed point that had to be hiding inside it. Then it would let that point come to it in its own time. The operation was authorized in the first weeks of 1992 and filed under a single word: the threshold. The service meant the term without metaphor. Somewhere in the sealed geometry of this man's existence, there had to be one doorway he would walk through in the open, because he could not bear not to. The entire operation was a wager that such a doorway existed, and that a man could be made to keep an appointment his enemy had already read. Finding it would take a year, a merchant, a clerk, and a pair of eyes on a hillside. And it would turn, in the end, on the one thing a man in hiding still lets himself love. The study began with the calendar of a man who appeared to keep no calendar at all. Through the spring of 1992, the service assembled the one thing the movement's security had failed to strip away: the ordinary residue of a family that exists in a community even when its head does not. A quartermaster can erase his own movements. He cannot easily erase his household. There is a wife who visits her mother. There are daughters who marry and sons who are schooled. There is a family that keeps the ordinary rights of a Shia household in the Bekaa, and those rights fall on dates that other people know. A man can vanish. A family leaves a wake. The service read that wake with patience. A wedding announced months ahead. A relative's illness that drew visitors. A season of small purchases that meant a household was preparing for something larger than an ordinary week. None of it touched Sabag directly, and all of it described the shape of his year. One name inside that household reshaped the operation. The eldest son, Jafar Sabag, about 22 years old, had left the valley for Syria. He had entered military training, and by the winter of 1992, he was only months from being commissioned as an officer. At the Homs Military Academy, the college that had trained the Syrian officer corps since 1933, the same institution from which Hafez al-Assad had graduated in 1955. For a Bekaa family bound to Syria and to Iran, an officer's son was an honor and an alliance both. It knitted the family into the very power that ruled the valley. For the father, it was something simpler and far more dangerous. Every intercept the service held on Saba, once the operational traffic was stripped away, kept circling the same private fact. The man who trusted nothing spoke of one thing without guarding it: his son's commissioning, and the morning he would watch the boy take the oath. A commissioning is the opposite of a private event. A passing out parade is the most public morning in a young officer's life, and it runs on a fixed and published order. The cadets form on the square in dress uniform. There is an inspection, a march past, the oath that ends a cadet's old life, the presentation of ranks, the sword of honor carried to the finest of the class, a final march before the stand. Families are seated and watching. The senior men sit under a covered stand at the front. The band plays. The date is set months out, and it does not move for anyone. Here, at last, was the threshold. A man who had not stood in open ground for a year and a half would sit in a reviewing stand on a named date in a foreign country before hundreds of witnesses, because his son was becoming an officer and no calculation on earth would keep him away. The service had spent a spring hunting for that one fixed point. The father had built it himself out of pride and love and hung a public schedule on it. All the service had to do now was learn the date, learn the seat, and find a way to be there. The threshold stood in Syria, and that single fact reshaped everything about how a man might reach it. The Bekaa was Syrian-held, but a foreigner could not simply appear there, and he certainly could not appear at a Syrian military academy in Homs. Every road carried checkpoints. The service at Anjar ran informers in every town. What the operation needed was a reason, a man whose face in these places asked no question of anyone. It built one, patiently, out of the most ordinary material in the country. The operative the file called Sami Khoury arrived in the valley not as a stranger, but as a trade. His legend was a produce and arak merchant out of Zaleh, the largely Christian town where the mountains meet the valley floor, terraced up the gorge of the Berdowni River, a place that called itself the city of wine and poetry. Its merchants had carried goods east across the border for generations. A Zaleh dealer buying grapes and selling spirits had reason to drive the length of the Bekaa, reason to stop in a dozen towns, reason to cross into Syria at the Masna post and carry on toward Homs. A cover survives by being boring, and a merchant's route is the most boring thing in the world. The geography rewarded the legend. Zahlo sat close to the Beirut to Damascus highway, the road that climbed out of Beirut over the Dar al-Baidar Pass at over 1,500 meters before dropping to the valley floor, then ran east to the frontier. From Zali, a merchant could reach Baalbek up the valley and the Syrian border down it without any journey seeming strange. Khoury drove an old Mercedes diesel, the indestructible saloon that carried half the country, and it made him invisible in the plainest sense. One more battered car on a valley road, indistinguishable from 10,000 others crossing the same ground. Building the legend was the slow work of months. A cover has to be a life other people can confirm, built slowly out of real acts. Khoury bought real grapes and sold real arak. He haggled, he complained about prices, he drank coffee with the men at the crossings until his face became furniture. The first weeks were the dangerous ones. When a legend is thin and a wrong answer at a checkpoint has no history behind it to catch it. He crossed at Masna again and again on small honest errands, letting the guards grow bored of him, until the sight of his car raised nothing at all. The economics of the valley did more for the cover than any forgery could. The Lebanese pound had collapsed. Through 1992, it fell past 2,500 to the dollar, a currency that had traded near 2 before the war, and prices in the markets moved between morning and afternoon. In an economy that broken, a man carrying real goods and hard currency was welcome everywhere and suspected nowhere. Behind Khoury stood a structure built so that no single failure could unravel the rest. The planner the file called Heron never entered the country. He ran the operation from outside, taking in product and issuing tasking, and he alone held the whole picture. Khoury knew his own piece and the next man's face, and nothing past it. A watcher the file called Kestrel would take the high ground above the compound. Each part was sealed from the others by design, so that a man stopped at a checkpoint could surrender only what he personally carried, which was almost nothing. By the late summer of 1992, the merchant was established, with customers, a route, and a face the checkpoints had stopped reading. He had everything except the one thing the operation existed to obtain: the exact date and the exact geometry of a morning in Homs. While the merchant built a life, the watcher built a record, and the record was the slower and harder of the two. Kestrel's task was the oldest in the craft, and the most punishing: to sit still and see. From high ground within sight of the Saba compound, in a position that could be held for hours without movement, the watcher logged the pattern of a household that believed it had none. The work ran across the seasons of 1992 and into the next year. In winter, the valley floor froze under a hard blue sky, and snow sat on the ridges to the east. By the following June, the floor was dry and brown, hazed with heat, while snow still capped Mount Hermon at more than 2,800 meters. The light changed with the months. The watching did not. Static observation is a discipline that punishes the body before it rewards the file. A watcher learns to move nothing, to note the delivery van and the hour it comes, the relative who visits on which day, the lamp that burns late in which window. Most of it is worth nothing on its own. The value is in the accumulation, in 1,000 dull entries that slowly draw the shape of a life. And below the watcher, night after night, the dead temples stood floodlit by nothing. 6 great columns black against the stars, a reminder that this valley kept its secrets for a very long time. What the record proved was the exact thing the operation had gambled on. Sabag's own movements were, as promised, unreadable. He came and went at no hour that repeated and used no vehicle twice in a pattern. On the compound's own rhythm, a foreign service could build nothing at all. But the household around him leaked what he sealed. The visits of relatives, the deliveries, the small preparations of a family with a son about to be honored. These gathered, week by week, into a shape, and the shape pointed north, toward Homs, toward a date in the following summer. One intercept, logged that spring, sat apart from all the rest. Stripped of anything operational, it was a father's call about a suit. Sabag wanted to know whether the tailor had finished the jacket he would wear to the parade, and whether it would be ready in time. And he said the boy had asked him to sit at the front where he could be seen. The analysts kept the fragment for what it was: the whole operation compressed into a sentence. The man who had erased himself for a year and a half meant to sit at the front, in the exact place his son could find his face. For the watcher on the hill, the year was its own kind of siege. There is a specific strain in observing a family across seasons, in coming to know a man's habits, his wife's routine, the son he speaks of in an unguarded voice. while holding, the entire time, the reason you are there. Kestrel's logs stayed clinical, because the craft requires that the observed stay a subject and never become a person. That distance is the only way the work gets done, and the watcher held it the way a diver holds breath, by refusing to think about the surface. By the turn of the year, the service knew the parade would fall in June of 1993. It knew the father would attend. What it still lacked was the one document that turns a certainty into an operation. The order of the day, down to the hour and the seat. A parade leaves a paper trail, and paper is kept by people who are paid too little to guard it. The academy at Homs ran on administration, rosters, seating plans, transport schedules, the running order of the ceremony itself. That paper passed through junior hands, and among those hands, the operation found the file called Marwan Sphere, a clerk in the academy's logistics office. He was moved by money. In a season when a state salary in the region bought almost nothing, and a quiet payment in hard currency remade a family's month. There was no cause in it and no ideology, only need, the oldest lever in the craft and the plainest. The approach was slow and deniable, and it never showed Sphere a face he could later describe. It ran through a cutout, a trusted intermediary who carried the money one way and the paper the other, and who knew neither the service above him nor the full weight of what the clerk was handing over. Signals were arranged the old way, without a word spoken in the open. A chalk mark that meant a package was waiting, a parcel left in a fixed place and collected an hour later by someone else. Sphere believed, as such men usually believe, that he was selling something harmless, arrangements, timings, the dull furniture of a graduation. What made the clerk's paper trustworthy was that it did not stand alone. Every claim he sold could be laid against the watcher's log from the valley and checked. When Sphere reported that a senior cadet's family was preparing to travel north, Kestrel had already recorded the same family readying itself in Baalbek weeks before. When he named a cadet standing high in his class, it matched a father who spoke of his son with unguarded pride. Two sources that had never touched each other, one in Homs and one on a Bekaa hillside, told the same story. In the craft, that agreement is the difference between a rumor and a plan. Across the winter and spring of 1993, he delivered exactly that, and it was worth more than any weapon in the valley. He delivered the date. He delivered the running order, the hour the cadets would form, the sequence of inspection and oath and march, the minute the sword of honor would be carried before the stand. And he delivered the one detail that turned a ceremony into a target. He delivered the seating. He confirmed which families would sit where. And he confirmed that the father of a senior cadet had asked for and been granted a place in the front rank of the guest stand, in clear line to the parade ground. Now the operation had geometry. It held the ground, the hour, and the exact patch of shaded seating where a man who never let himself be seen in the open would sit, still, for the better part of a morning. Fixed there by the one force stronger than his own discipline, the wish to be seen by his son. Every element the service had assembled across a year now converged on a single rectangle of space and a single window of time. The paper also settled the method by settling the problem. A man reachable only among his own protectors, inside a foreign garrison town, could not be approached at close quarters by anyone the service was willing to risk. The morning would have to be solved from a distance, using the one thing the year had purchased that no defense could take back: the certainty of exactly where he would be and when. What remained was the hardest part of all, and it lay across a border inside a military academy, surrounded by the very army his family had just joined. An operation built across a year can die in a single week, and this one very nearly did. The spring of 1993 pressed on threshold from three directions at once. The first was security. A Syrian intelligence sweep moved through the Bekaa that season. The routine tightening of a service that ruled the valley by fear. And for a stretch of days, the checkpoints that had learned to wave the merchant through were stopping and searching everything that passed. Cars were emptied onto the roadside. Papers were read twice. One unlucky search, one question the legend could not answer cleanly, and a year of work ended in an interrogation room at Anjar. It came close once. During the worst of the sweep, Khouri's car was pulled to the roadside at a checkpoint he had passed 100 times, and a young Syrian soldier, bored and thorough, took the vehicle apart. The boxes of produce lifted out. The spare wheel rolled onto the verge. The papers held up against the light. The legend had nothing to hide, which was the entire point of a legend built from real grapes and real receipts. And after a quarter of an hour, the soldier waved him on with the sourness of a man who had found nothing. Khouri drove on at the same unhurried pace he always kept, did not look back, and reported the stop that night as though it were weather. The second pressure was money, which is to say, cover. The same currency collapse that had made Khouri welcome everywhere now made the economy convulse. Prices moved by the day. Trade stalled. Suppliers who had sold to him for a year suddenly could not fix a price at all. A merchant whose business could not function was a merchant who had lost his reason to travel. And the reason to travel was the whole of the cover. For several weeks, the operation quietly spent hard currency to keep a produce trade breathing that existed only to justify one man's presence on a road. The third pressure came from the south, and it was the largest. Across that summer, the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah was climbing toward the open, and in the last week of July, it would break into a 7-day Israeli operation across southern Lebanon. Any major action against the movement risked a lockdown everywhere. Checkpoints doubled, strangers examined, crossings slowed to a crawl. The window in Homs sat in June, ahead of that storm. But only just, and no one directing the operation could be certain the storm would hold to its schedule and not arrive early. The men in the south were not part of Threshold and knew nothing of it, and that was its own danger. A separate arm of the same establishment was preparing a blow that could, if it landed a week early, slam every checkpoint in the country shut and strand a merchant on the wrong side of a border. Nobody could ask the South to wait. Nobody could tell the South why they might want to. The two operations ran toward the same fortnight in complete ignorance of each other. And the men running Threshold could only watch the calendar and hope the larger war kept its appointment after theirs. For a run of days, the men running Threshold weighed, folding it. A year of work and a rare access argued for pressing on. Prudence argued for closing a hand that had grown expensive and exposed, and walking away while the walking was still clean. What held the operation together in the end was a cold reading of the calendar. The parade would not move. The father would not miss it. Walk away now, and the service would not see another morning like this for years, if ever, because a son is commissioned only once in a life. The Threshold would open in June and close for good by noon of the same day. So they pressed on, and they spent the money, and they held the legend still through the sweep rather than pulling it out. Because a merchant who suddenly disappeared was more suspicious than one who simply endured a bad season like everyone else. By the first days of June, the sweep had passed. The trade had steadied, and the South still held its breath. The operation had survived its own near collapse, and the date was no longer a season off. It was a fortnight. To reach a Syrian parade ground, the operation had to leave the country it understood and enter one where it had no friends at all. Lebanon in 1993 was a place a foreign service could work. Fractured, war-worn, thick enough with strangers to hide one more. Syria was another matter. Syria was a police state that ran on its own intelligence apparatus, and an academy town like Homs was as controlled as ground gets, thick with soldiers and the men who watched them. The merchant's legend, which had carried Kuri the length of the Bekaa, thinned the instant it crossed the frontier. Past the Masna post, with its long stretch of no man's land running some 8 kilometers between the two countries, Azaleh produce dealers still had reasons to be in Syria. But fewer of them, and everyone had to hold under a harder gaze. The plan never placed the service's own men inside the ceremony. That discipline had kept the operation alive for a year, and it was not broken at the end for the sake of a closer look. The approach used distance, and it used the target's own certainty against him. The single thing the year of work had bought was exactly that certainty. The precise seat, the precise hour, the precise patch of ground a specific man would occupy while his attention was fixed wholly on his son. In the craft, certainty of place and time is the rarest currency there is, and it can be spent on a shot that never requires the shooter to enter the room. The instrument the region offered was the Dragunov, the marksman's rifle that had armed every service and militia in the Levant since the 1960s. It threw a 7.62 round at something near 830 meters a second, and it stayed effective well past 600 meters, out toward 1,300 in trained hands. Its optical sight graduated for the distance. A weapon that, common to the ground, carried no signature at all. It said nothing about the hand that had fired it, and it could have belonged to any army or faction between the sea and the desert. In the last days, the ground itself was read the way the schedule had been. The approaches to the academy, the lines of sight a garrison town allows, and the many more it does not. The roads that led away, and the hours they were busy. All of it was studied and turned into a plan whose whole aim was to make the morning end with a stranger already leaving before anyone knew a stranger had come. Nothing about the withdrawal could depend on speed, because speed draws the eye. It depended on being ordinary in a place where the extraordinary had just happened, on moving at the pace of a man with nowhere in particular to be, through a country that would, within the hour, be looking hard for exactly the opposite. There was a night in that last fortnight when the operative sat with the whole of it. He had spent a year becoming a man who did not exist. A merchant with opinions about grape prices, a face the checkpoints trusted, a life assembled entirely to deliver one family to one morning. The cost of a long legend is that it works on the man wearing it. He had learned the names of a tailor and a clerk and a father. He had listened through the file to a man ask, in an unguarded moment, after his son. He had come to know the daily shape of a household he was helping to end. And somewhere across the year, the household had stopped being a diagram and become a family with a name. He did not resolve the feeling, because the craft offers no resolution, only sequence. There was a date and a seat and a distance and a task. He returned to the task, and in the morning he was the merchant again, haggling over grapes on a valley road as if nothing in the world weighed on him. The date was set. The geometry was fixed. All that remained was for a father to keep the appointment he could not bear to miss. The morning came dry and bright, the way June comes to that country. The valley floor brown with heat, the far ridges still holding their snow, the light hard and flat before the sun was fully up. At the academy, the day ran precisely as the paper had promised. because a passing out parade is a machine, and a machine keeps time. In the early hours, the cadets formed on the square in dress uniform, boots and belts squared, the band assembling to one side. By 0700 hours, the families were arriving and taking their seats. Under the covered stand at the front, in the shaded rank kept for the honored guests, a man took his place in clear view of the ground. He had not been photographed in the open in all the long months of the operation. He sat now for all to see, because his son was out there on that square, and because he had asked to sit where the boy could find his face. Weigh what it had cost him to be there. For a year and a half, this man had denied himself every ordinary thing. The same mosque twice, a car he liked, a walk in daylight, any pattern a watcher could hold. He had survived by giving up the small freedoms other men never think about. And he had spent all of that discipline to buy exactly this: the right to sit in the open on a known morning and watch his son become an officer. The caution had a purpose, and the purpose was this seat. The ceremony moved through its order, one published step after another. The inspection first, the ranks of new officers rigid at attention, while senior men walked the line. Then the march past, the column wheeling across the square to the band. Then the oath, the exact moment a cadet stops being a cadet and becomes an officer of the Syrian army. The father watched his son take it, an alliance and an honor to the movement, and to one unguarded man in the stands, simply a boy he loved doing a fine thing on a fine morning. Then came the presentation of ranks, and the sword of honor carried to the best of the class, and the whole stand's attention went forward to the climax of the morning. Every face in the front rank turned the same way, toward the square, toward the sword, away from the open ground beyond the seating. For a few seconds, the entire event pointed in one direction, and the father looked only at his son. Everything narrowed to those few seconds, the ones the operation had been built for and no others. The cadets stood dressed and still. The senior officers watched the sword move down the line toward the finest of the class. In the stands, hundreds of faces were turned to the ceremony's single bright point, and among them, a father leaned very slightly forward to keep his son in view. Every element the service had spent a year assembling, the merchant, the watcher, the clerk, the seat, the certainty, existed only to deliver this: a still man in a known chair, with his guard down and his eyes elsewhere. For the length of time it takes to present a sword, it was the most exposed he had let himself be in the whole of his hidden life. The strike came into that stillness. It came without warning to the man it was meant for, in the one interval when the whole ceremony had aligned him. Seated, fixed, his attention forward, his protection loosened into the ordinary ease of a right among his own people. There was no approach to see and no confrontation to hear. There was a single report that the crowd would afterward struggle to place against the noise of a parade, and a man in a new jacket went still in his seat. For a moment the mourning continued around him, because a parade is loud, and a crowd is watching the sword and not the stands. By the time the ground understood what had happened in its midst, the distance that had made the shot possible had already made the shooter gone. The window the service had spent a year prizing open had stood open for the length of a ceremony's climax. And the length of a ceremony's climax had been enough. Haj Zulfikar, Kamal Sabag, the man the valley never saw, had been reached in the one place his enemies were never meant to be able to reach him. On the one morning he could not stay away, in front of the son whose honor had drawn him into the light. News of the kind that matters in the Bekaa moves in silence, carried by the people who know and kept from the people who do not. There was no announcement worth the name. A logistics commander is not a public figure, and his death was not a public event. The movement would not confirm what it could not afford to explain. And the Syrian authorities who ran Homs had their own reasons to keep a killing at one of their military academies out of the light. To the world beyond the valley, almost nothing had happened. Inside the network Sabag had built, everything had. For the men who had relied on him, the loss registered less as grief than as arithmetic, and the arithmetic was brutal. A quartermaster carries a map that lives partly on paper and partly in his own head. The routes, the contacts, the standing payments, the balance of a dozen quiet arrangements that never touch a page. When such a man dies suddenly, the paper survives and the memory does not, and a network spends months relearning what one man had simply carried. That was the true yield of the operation. It removed a store of knowledge that could not be written down. At the precise moment, it would cost the most to replace. The investigation that followed ran straight into the wall the operation had built on purpose. The compartmentation held. There had been a merchant who, it emerged, had stopped coming through some weeks before. But merchants stopped and started all the time in that broken economy. And the man had left nothing behind him except a plausible trade and a face people half remembered. There had been a clerk in the logistics office whose small new comforts might have drawn a harder look in a calmer year. But the year was not calm, and the harder look never came. The threads the movement pulled came apart in its hands because they had been cut long before anyone thought to pull them. For a time, the movement looked for its leak in the obvious places. The men closest to Saba, the couriers, the family's own circle. Because a network under attack turns first on itself. It found nothing, because there was nothing of the service left inside it to find. The man who had carried money into Homs had never met an officer of the service. The man who had watched the compound had never gone near the family. The merchant who tied the valley to the border had been, as far as anyone could prove, only ever a merchant. Suspicion needs a thread to follow, and every thread had been cut at both ends. What the valley was left with was a fact with no shape to it. That the most careful man any of them had known had been killed in the safest place he had gone in a very long time, and that no one could say by whom or how a single morning of his life had been read before he lived it. Every operation is weighed twice, once for what it achieved and once for what it cost, and the two totals rarely balance. What threshold achieved was real and countable in the terms the service used. A supply line running through the Bekaa lost the one man who understood the whole of it. The disruption bought time and cost the movement more than the death of any single fighter could. Because the man hardest to replace is never the man who pulls a trigger. On the ledger the service kept, the operation was a success of a particularly clean kind. A year of patience, one morning, no pursuit, no trace left on the ground. No wider war set off in a town where a wider war was always one wrong step away. The other total was harder to set down. The intercept the analysts had kept, the father asking after a jacket, asking to sit where his son could see him, came back at the end, because it held the entire cost in a single line. The operation had found no flaw in the man's tradecraft, because there was almost none to find. What it reached instead was the one thing he refused to surrender when he surrendered everything else. The wish to watch his son become the thing he had raised him to be. The service had not defeated his caution. It had defeated his love, and it had used the son's proudest morning as the means. For the son, an officer of a single day, the morning he had worked years toward became the morning his father was killed a few meters from him. Whatever the young man became after that, He would carry the day inside every honor that ever followed, because the two could never again be pulled apart. That is the entry the ledger has no column for, and it is the one that does not fade when the operational gain has long since been spent. An operation is meant to end when its target does. This one did not, and it was never going to, because it had reached the man through the person most certain to carry the morning for the rest of his life. Set the two truths side by side, because the operation lives in the space between them and refuses to leave it. On one side stands the service. A man moved the weapons and money that armed a war. He had made himself unreachable by every legitimate means, and the only moment he ever offered the world was a morning at his son's parade. To take that moment was to end a supply line at its source with a single act and no wider bloodshed, the most surgical form of a terrible thing. To refuse it was to let the line run and the war go on, and other mornings end elsewhere for other families. On the other side stands the son, and the morning meant to be the proudest of his life. A ceremony built to honor a young man was turned into the instrument of his father's death before his eyes, with his own achievement used as the bait that drew the target into the open. Whatever the father was, the son had earned that day cleanly, and it was taken from him and remade into something else entirely. So here is the question this file leaves open, and it does not carry a clean answer. When a man can be reached only through the people he loves, is the service that reaches him there doing the necessary work of ending a war, or crossing the one line that was supposed to stay uncrossed? Tell us where you land, and tell us where in the world you are watching from. If this operation held you, that is the purpose of Agent Uncovered. One buried file opened to the last page. Tell us where you would draw the line the service crossed and where you are watching from. Subscribe for the next operation and send this one to the person who argues these questions the way you do.